everyone, and welcome to Vertical Playpen. My name is Phil, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about, or I am going to be talking about, the top 5 skills that I believe a belayer should have. I'm in my home studio, and oh, worth mentioning. I'm sort of skipping over something, but we are filming videos now alongside the audio, and we're placing the video onto YouTube. So you can watch kind of like an AI edited version of the podcast if you would like by going to YouTube and searching High Five Adventure, and that should bring you to the videos. I will put the links in any socials as well. So, if you are watching on video, you're probably thinking, "Wow, Phil, I never see you wearing a hat." So I'm wearing a trucker's hat. I think I kind of like the look of it. It says podcaster on it, and I'm doing that because I did not do my hair today. A little bit of insider. The sausage is made. Always an odd phrase, but I just used it there. So, in this episode, as mentioned before, I'm going to be talking about what I believe are the top 5 skills that a belayer should possess. Now, I'm going to skip over the obvious one, which is like general belay technique. Like knowing how to perform the technique is obviously an essential to being a belayer, but I'm going to add 5 skills that I think will make you a greater belayer. And these are things I often mention in trainings and I see people not doing, so that's why I'm going to bring them up in this episode. Now, I do want to add that these are my opinions. You can disagree as much as you would like, or you can definitely agree. That's up to you. And I encourage you to connect with me, reach out either via Instagram or on email with what you believe to be your 5 skills. I may also be putting in the coming days some stories out onto Instagram that will ask you about yours. So let's start with tip number 1. Now, this does belong in the kind of physicality area. I'm going to be talking about the physicality part and then your general presence as a belayer. But this one I do think is critical and is something that is missed. Now, I am somebody who, due to a childhood of like jumping out of trees and kind of high impact stuff I used to do, jumping in track and field, and was not the best at landing. I have a deteriorated lower lumbar disc, so I have 3 deteriorated lower lumbar discs. And because of that, I have to be really cautious about how my body interacts when belaying. That doesn't mean I can't belay someone heavier than me. It just means my technique needs to adapt to meet that kind of requirement. And I think the critical piece, and this is where this tip is your overall belay stance. If you are somebody who bends over or rocks or twists and rotates as you belay, then you are going to ultimately impact your lower back. And you'll also impact your shoulders based on the way that you're pulling the rope through the belay device. If you are ever having to force something or pulling it, like you're white knuckling, squeezing the rope too tight, all of those things are probably indicators that you're maybe not using your correct technique. And so what I often consider is that you've got like this window frame from, I would say, around the eye level is the top of that frame, and your hips are the lowest part of the frame. And then obviously you've got the sides that aren't really going too far beyond your hips and your shoulders. So you've kind of got this rectangle, and that your hands should stay within that kind of rectangle. And what that will encourage you to do if you try to get in that mindset, it will keep your more upright because your arms are moving within that window frame. And that will prevent you from taking too much rope and leaning down below the frame, twisting, which will bring you outside of that frame, or maybe bouncing, which might lift you up outside of the top of the frame. So if you can kind of keep yourself within that, you'll do your back a service in terms of your stance. Be sure to check out my Instagram. That's at Vertical Playpen, and you'll see some videos of me talking about belay stance and the importance of that. And I'm going to go into more details in future trainings about that. And spoiler alert, there will be potentially a one-day training at High Five where I'm going to be talking a lot about the physicality of belaying and how you can protect yourself in the long term. I think it's really critical that we do this because I want to be able to do this for as long as I possibly can. And knowing this is a physical industry, I need to protect myself. I remember there was a comment maybe on one of the Facebook forums about someone saying about backs, and there were a lot of pushback. Well, that's a interesting unintentional pun there, around like, I've been doing this 50 years and my back's fine, right? That kind of statement I think is not helpful. And as I'm saying younger in quotes, I'm closer to 40 now than I ever was to 30, but um, I would say like I'm really cautious about my body when it comes to my belaying. And so tip number one, the frame, and try to keep yourself within it, stance is important. So second one now is about general communication with the belayer. The climber. The best belayers that I see out there have a really good way to communicate with their climber. That doesn't mean just constant reaffirmations, but it means just general check-ins and understanding what tension needs to be on the rope based on the climber. So if you notice that if they're on a traversing element, let's say, and they're getting dragged towards the middle, the pulley is sliding, and they need you to give them some more rope, so pay out some rope, reduce that tension, give them some slack. Lots of terms there that sort of mean that same thing. But you should be able to do that and almost anticipate when that comes, but be constantly checking in with a climber. That's also important to know, when they want to come down. There's a lot of social anxiety and social pressure, peer pressure to go beyond where you're comfortable. So I'm always checking in with a climber and seeing how they're doing. At the ladder, just going up to them before they've even climbed and just asking, what level of support do you need from me? What do you need from others? And reaffirming that idea that they can connect with me at any point. And the same on the way down. And once they've come down, go straight over to them. Don't just unclip them and ask for the next climber, but just have a check-in, communicate. It's all about that connection. And the greater the connection between you and the climber, the more trust they have in you, and then the more likely they'll be able to empower themselves to take that next step and challenge themselves. If you're hearing like, oh, I don't get many climbers, I don't get people who want to climb, that might be take a little bit on yourself and say that maybe you are not connecting and communicating with them in a way that is super effective to encourage them to climb. So that's tip number 2, and that's overall communication with the climber. I would say this is like tip number 3. I'm wedging this in the middle, but I just think this is a general thing because once again, my job is teaching belaying, so I interact with this a lot. I interact this more with people who have been doing this a while, but I identify the greatest belayers, and it maybe is because it makes my job a little easier, but the greatest belayers are those who are willing to receive information and feedback on their stance and be able to adapt it. If you have been performing what is known as a slip, slap, slide, so hands up belaying for a long period of time, and you hear someone correct that behavior or just say, hey, I think it would be more beneficial pairing it with a aperture friction belay device to be doing what's known as the pull, break, underslide, or the P-bus method of belaying, then your response should be, oh, excellent. I'm excited to learn that. Can you teach me that? And you'll be able to pick it up pretty quick. Anytime I interact with resistance to feedback, that for me is a bit of a red flag. That doesn't demonstrate you as a belayer having the greatest skill sets. It means you are very limited in your lane. And my hope for belayers is that you know more than what you need to so that you can adapt on the fly. That doesn't mean you need to become a belay expert, but just being willing to hear somebody else's opinions on belay stance and technique, I think is really important. And what that does as well is it role models for the next generation of belayers so that they're not in that same situation and think, oh, well, so-and-so told me this, and this is the way it has to be done. So flexibility of your own mindset around belaying, I think is real critical. And I take that on board as well. So I find myself consistently learning about where I need to be, positions and stances, and lots of technique stuff. And I listen to people's opinions on their stances and techniques. And with some technology, it's applicable. And in some places, it's applicable. And in others, it's not. So try not to be resistant to the instruction being given when you are working on your belaying. And that will make you a better belayer. Seems like a little bit an obvious one. And of course, that's coming from me and my experience of having that resistance. And I will be honest, my judgment of those people that they are, if they're resistant, okay, they're probably not the best belayer in the world. They're not listening to feedback, not only from peers and other people around them, but maybe also they're not listening to climbers as well when they say they want to come down. That kind of resistance is always a little alarming for me. This one I think is also somewhat aligned with, like, if you've been doing this a while, I see this a lot, is just general complacency with checklists. There's a book I've referenced so much that's getting annoying. So if at this stage you haven't read it, you probably will never, but it's called Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande. And what I really love is that the checklist is not about how long you've been doing this, but is about, in fact, it's quite the opposite. It's like how long you've been doing this checklist keeps you in check, because it's when complacency sets in. So as I relate to this is like twists in harnesses, buckles not being double backed, carabiners not being closed, twists in the rope above, um, not having ladder spotters, like just these general things that I tend to notice that, especially when I train people who have been doing this a while, a level 2 level, as an example, I see these things consistently. Not pinning the gear in a traversing element, thinking about belay stance, how are you standing? Um, and I correct a lot of people on this, and I think that they sometimes are like, embarrassed, but I think that it's the reality that when you've been doing this a while, you miss them. When I train people at level 1, for the first year or so they're doing that for their first season, they're incredible belayers because they are so in tune with checking. And when you get complacent and you try to go fast, you sort of miss those. And so then you get into that motion of missing steps. It happened very recently at a program I was leading. Some really skilled facilitators were missing certain things like twists in ropes and harnesses not being put in accurately, and not going through your check. Like, if you're a head to toe inspection of a climber, and when I say that, head to toe means you're checking their shoes, you're coming up, check the harness, so all good, checking their hardware, what's clipped in, following up if they've got any things that could be caught in the gear, get rid of those. Helmets, are they on accurately? Then look all the way up to the rope, check if there are any twists, anything wrong there. Come straight back down to you as the belayer, and then check yourself. What is your setup like? Is your carabiner clipped in? Do that check as well, and then do your harness, and then down to your shoes. So that would be toe-to-toe checks. Or you could be like the 4H's, which is you're checking harness, hardware, helmet, and then the human, which I think is an important thing. It sometimes gets a little smirk over, but I do think it's important to check in. Goes back to that previous tip of communicating with your climber. So look beyond the checklist. Like, do the checklist, be aware, don't get complacent, have an awareness. That will make you a better belayer if you just get in those habits. People will ask me in level 2 trainings how I catch so many open carabiners. It's a little bit like my eye is just trained to that. And the hope is that you get to that point where I'm always scanning, always checking that harness, always checking the carabiners, always looking up. I've just gotten such a habitual nature about that I always review my checklists. And once again, catch me if I make a mistake during a training, because it's happened. I had an open carabiner when I was climbing one time, self-belayed climbing, and somebody caught it, and they felt bad for calling me out, and I applauded them for doing that, because it can take a lot to call out the trainer on it. But please do that. Same with your trainers. It's just constant reminders that we need to be critical and checking, and we don't get complacent. I think I'm on my last tip. So this is tip number 5. And this is just general. This is about physics. Now, I will never claim to be an expert in physics. I do not have a degree in it, but I think it's really important to understand pendulums, specifically when belaying. So um, if you are belaying and you are too far back, if someone was to fall, the angle is so large that you are going to get dragged forwards. You have less rope on the device up top, so there's less friction. So that's not advantageous to you. So getting closer, understanding how close you need to be, but also understanding might it affect your neck. If you're really craned all the way looking up, well, one, maybe don't do that so much. You can always stretch your neck and look down, but go back when necessary, come forward when necessary. Go to the sides to prevent pendulums. This is one of the things that, when I say it sometimes in trainings, people look at me as like, it's controversial. If you're on a traversing element, and at the start when they climb, you want to pin the gear to prevent pendulums. And the point of that is that if they're climbing up the ladder and they come off the ladder and you are not pinning the gear, the hardware, the pulley and the SRD off to the side, as far over to the end point as you can get it, if they fall off, they will swing back to where the pulley is currently sitting. So if you've got the cable and you have a pulley and it's somewhere further out, that's where the rope wants to be. So you're pinning it all the way over to the far end. So the controversial part, though, is what to do at the end. I see this so often in traversing elements where you will ask the climber to go all the way over to the far end. They get there, they touch the tree, kiss the tree, hug the tree, whatever you do, celebratory. And then you say, okay, now turn around, come a few steps back before I lower you. Now, when I've asked people why they do that, their consideration is that they don't want them to hit the tree, swing into the tree, they don't want to hit the ladders, all of those things. But if you want to, once again, if you want to control where they come down, think about where that gear is. You can prevent that pulley from sliding if you pin the rope over the other side. So I move myself out. I can have them climb lower from that tree point or that end point, that pole, and they can just lower, and I can pretty much aim them. So sometimes I do this in trainings. I put a hula hoop on the floor, and my task to a belayer is to land the climber in the hula hoop. And once they understand that principle of where I can do it based on angles, you'll be able to move people around in the course and lower them where you need to and ensure they avoid things. So if you've got elements where they are kind of swing into a platform that's in the air and you're worried about that, you can lower them between where you're not going to swing in. And just understanding if they're coming off a catwalk, they lean back, and if you want to lower them a little quickly so they get past that catwalk, and then all of those components, I think, will ultimately enhance your belaying, where you're not having the climber have to do things to prevent things from happening, but you on the ground are able to do that. Don't put the pressure on the climber to do extra things. We ask them to climb all the way to a side if they're traversing. We applaud them and then ask them to do a almost harder thing, which is turn around and maybe come backwards, just to try to mitigate a problem that we could solve on the ground. So understanding physics will prevent you from getting pulled and dragged if you're a lighter belayer, and also prevent the climber from swinging into things if you understand where to lower them. So those are my 5 tips. I will go over those briefly again. The 5 tips are, if I remember them, because I'm sort of talking off the top of the dome. The first one is physics and belay stance, the frame. We have communication with the climber. We have a willingness to receive instruction, looking beyond the checklist, and then physics. Understanding the physics and the angles will help you be a better belayer. So hopefully that was helpful to you. Once again, if you want some kind of visual representation, if the audio doesn't help you as much, you've got YouTube, where you can see me gesticulating with my hands. I'm a very handsy kind of talker. And so if you want to see that, you'll go to YouTube. If you want to just hear me, you're probably already doing so because you're on a podcast. But also, if you want to go to Vertical Playpen's Instagram, which is at Vertical Playpen, you will see some reels and some tips and some carousels and all that stuff about some of these tips, and I will give them in a more bite-sized visual medium there. So thank you so much for listening to this, and I hope this has been valuable to you, and I'll see you on the next one.